Good afternoon. It's 5:04 here Eastern Time in Cincinnati. A little bit late tonight for several reasons. I was in a telephone conference and with the dean, and obviously, when the dean wants to meet, you have to meet, and I couldn't get away from that. So we're going to discuss pretty much through tonight interviewing. I have some slides here to show you and to talk about, and both from the slides that I've been using right along and from the other resource that I have, the Henneman text about staffing organizations. As you know, for next week, there is no written assignment. There are two forum assignments for next week. But we're going to talk tonight about interviewing because hopefully it will set you up, give you some ideas of how to conduct your interview. Now, mostly what I'm going to discuss tonight, talk about tonight, what the slides are going to talk about is how a hiring manager or an HR person or a combination of panel or a group or something of that nature conducts a hiring interview. But I want you to take some of the same thought processes for the interview that you're going to do, that you're going to conduct with an HR person. You should go in with a written list. You should not go in and try to wing it. That won't work because you want the person you're interviewing, you want that person to stay on your schedule, not in his or her schedule. So have a list of questions and ask them and check that. There's some information in week 8 about doing a list that you can look at. I'm not conducting a audio and video lecture next week, and what I do have on there for next week is well, it's minimal. I won't say it's not comprehensive, but it's not exhausting, and it doesn't take a long period of time. So what I want to tell you now is if you have not started your interview, if you've not made an appointment for an interview, please do so now because the interview is due to me by the 21st of December at 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time. You want to get that in on time. It's very important that you do that. Assignment 7, as you know, as I've just alluded to, is to interview a human resource, human resources manager, a director in human resources, a senior analyst, and inquire about their interview methods, restrictions, and prohibitions. What this really means is interview methods refers to how job candidates are questioned, what restrictions the organization places on those conducting the job interview, and what prohibitions it has regarding the type of questions asked. Now we know, as we've looked through the text, that there are some prohibitions, that questions we know you can't ask. You can't ask when you graduated from high school. You can't ask when you graduated from high school. We can't ask some other type things that are age related. We can't do that. We can't ask questions that are leading about if it's a woman, you plan on getting married. If you plan on getting married, you plan on having children, things of that nature. We simply can't do those things. But companies may place some other restrictions on their interviewers. So restrictions, prohibitions, as I say here, and as you can read in the lecture notes, have the same meaning, but they're actually somewhat different. Now, somebody may say to me, maybe you're slicing the salami too thin, and that may be the case. But I'm going to try to make this dichotomy between the two. Restrictions can refer to the type of questions not asked or that you can't ask. We know that. What's the purpose of the employment interview? Well, the purpose of the employment interview is an exchange of information. The person interviewing is telling the interviewer, this is what I can do, these are my skills, this is my background, this is the experience that I have, etc. The interviewer, on the other hand, provides information about the organization and asks questions to determine if the potential employee is either a good fit for the open job or he is a or she is a good fit for the organization. And then also trying to determine if this person is the best candidate. So you're looking at job fit for first, and job fit, then taking that to a step further, is this person the best candidate for the job? If that person is not necessarily a good fit, but it's a pretty good candidate for the organization, then you want to look someplace else. What do we have open this person might be able to fill? Or do we have something we know is coming open in a month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or whatever that happens to be? The interviewee, as I said, is trying to sell him or herself that she is the best candidate. According to the text authors, the interview has 3 objectives. First is gathering information. Yes, the potential employee has completed an application and provided a resume. Maybe those, but those don't paint the entire picture. Because the picture is incomplete, the interview is a probing exercise, if you will, designed to fill in the blanks or complete the picture or bring the picture into better focus, if you will, and then add some clarity to the information that's provided. See this on pages 204 and 205 in the text. Pardon me. Second, as mentioned before, the interviewer provides information. Yes, the interviewer, excuse me, I want to make sure that I read my note properly, provides information about the organization. Usually this is a general sketch. Now, why do I want to say general sketch? Why not a complete sketch? Well, the interviewer is trying to give a picture of the organization in general, but not so much the specific work site. That's up to the hiring manager to do. So perhaps if this is the hiring manager, then he or she will go a little bit further than just a general sketch and complete the dots, if you will. The interviewer provides information about salary, benefits, working conditions, and other pertinent job-related information. It is important that the information given be accurate and a potential employee is interviewed. So we are now, if this person is a candidate, he or she is not an applicant, and that's why I'm using the term potential employee. Receive a realistic job preview. Ivancovich, in his 9th edition of Human Resource Management, published in 2004, says a traditional job preview paints a rosy picture when that may not be the case, whereas a realistic job preview, also known as RJP, sets expectations in positive, unvarnished manner. An RJP usually leads to high job satisfaction and lower turnover, which we know is very, very critical. Third is to leave the applicant, and I should have said candidate here, and I do have that in parentheses, with a positive view of the company. If this candidate is not selected but has skills you could use in another position, as we've said before, you don't want this person to leave with a bad impression. Think back to our case for discussion that we had about the interview that Sheila was conducting with Alan, and she didn't want to conduct it in the first place. She deferred to the HR manager, and now she's being interrupted, phone calls and potential disasters happening, et cetera, et cetera. One of the questions we have to ask in our mind, it was not asked in the case study, but one of the questions we have to ask in our mind is, what kind of realistic job preview does Alan have about that? He may have an idea that Sheila is not a micromanager, but that all problems have to be brought to her. and that other people are not empowered to take care of issues that arise. He may feel that everything he does has to be uh, sanctioned by her. Now, of course, that talks about micromanagement to some extent. Obviously, that's possibly true. So when Alan excuses himself by saying, I have to pick up my wife, and Sheila's on the phone, and she says, call me later today, what do you think he's going to do? My belief is he's not going to call back. Or if he does call back, he's going to say, I'm not interested. Because while he's maybe not gotten a realistic job preview, he's got a preview of the chaos in that department. And therefore, he's probably not going to be able to say, I can live with this. I'm okay with this. Is that an indication of what's going to happen all the time? We don't know that, but it certainly put a seed of doubt in his mind. At least that's my take on it. You may have a different opinion, and that's fine. But I think once you put the seed of doubt in a candidate's mind, it's very difficult for him or her to get beyond that and say, well, things are going to change. You'd like that person to consider applying again. Maybe you want Alan to come back. Alan may not be the ideal candidate, but you want him to come back. What's been placed in his mind right now, I don't think is a very good picture. And so, as I just continue, and you can see other places, he's likely not to come back. I mean, if Sheila said to him when he was leaving, Alan, I want to consider you for a different position, what do you think he's going to say? I don't think he's going to have a good opinion. Now, one of the things that you should do when you're going through, and this is a suggestion, by the way, you do not have to follow what I'm going to say to you. We're going to talk now about structured and unstructured interviews. I've got some slides here to show you, and we'll talk about this, and I'm going to get to the end and give you some conclusions that Stewart and Brown have come up with, and some other information that I found about interviews. So you want to ask if they use a structured interview. What you're saying here is, are all candidates for the same job asked the same questions? If the answer is yes, and I would hope that it would be, pardon me, then you ought to ask if they use a scoring system to complement the structured interview. The questions don't have to be asked in the same sequence, so that's not relevant, and you don't have to ask that. But you do want to ask if they have a structured interview. And so if they do, and then you want to ask, why do you have a structured interview? You want to get that information. If they don't have a structured interview, you want to ask why they don't use a structured interview. Remember, what you're doing here is you're gathering information. And then you're going to get the information that you've gathered from your interview and compare and contrast it to the concepts presented in the text. I do want to caution you, and I think I say it later, and I'll mention it if I come across it again. And that is, you tell the person that who's agreed to be interviewed that the information that you gather is protected. You won't share any confidential information. If they say, okay, don't want you to name the company, that's fine. I would like you to at least name the position that the person holds, so I have some kind of an idea of who you're interviewing and what his or her standing is within in the company. Company doesn't have to be named. The person you interview doesn't have to be named. But please ask those questions. I'm not interested in proprietary information. I don't want confidential information. You can tell the person you interview that the information that stops with me. It doesn't go anywhere. I don't share that with anybody. If they need a written guarantee for that, let me know. I'd be happy to do that. We're trying to see what you've learned, how you may have learned to interview, and then how you can take that information that you've gathered and do a good contrast and comparison. If the folks say that you're interviewing, the HR the person that you're interviewing says no, they don't use a structured interview, then ask why they don't use a structured interview. And those questions have to be followed up easily so that it doesn't seem like you're being argumentative. Now, why do they see, what is the benefit of not using a structured format? Is the organization looking for free-flowing information that they don't believe they can get from a structured interview? If so, does it have some way of measuring the answers when they're not using a structured format? Ivancovich talks about, and we've talked about this before, but it's important to discuss it again now, and that is two types of structured interview. There's the behavioral description interview, BDI, and the situational description interview, situational interview. The BDI asks applicants, candidates, I should avoid that because we're now at the candidate stage, to rate the actual incidents from their past relevant work experience as it applies to the current job they're seeking, or how they would see it applying to the current job they're seeking. This type of interview is based upon the assumption that past experience is a good predictor of future results. An example of this type of structured interview would be, in your last job, how did you resolve a conflict between subordinates or between a customer and an employee? After receiving the response, the interviewer would follow up with, was the conflict resolved to each party's satisfaction? Did you have a sense of accomplishment in resolving the conflict, or were you frustrated? And they may want to take that a step further, asking the candidate to enlarge upon what he or she said. Now, once they do that, if that is not part of the structured interview, now they're into free-flowing answers, and there has to be that. Now they're into something that is like an unstructured interview because that question is not listed for them to ask. So what they simply could be doing would be asking somebody to enlarge upon that particular question, and then they would get somewhere along the line where they would have a good, bad, or not so good response, and then that would be scored accordingly. Ivancovich goes on to say that the situational interview also seeks to identify if the candidate has the needed skills to perform the job duties for which he or she is applying that open position, and he or she is motivated to do the job. This is similar to a candidate's can-do and will-do abilities, but the situational interview uses a different tactic. It uses hypothetical scenarios that the applicant might encounter on the job. For example, a customer might ask a salesperson to provide information about a particular product that is not currently available to the general public. So the interviewer might ask, what research would you conduct to get the information the customer has requested? This does not mean, responses are then scored according to how they dovetail with the job for which the interview is being conducted. Ivancovich continues by saying, the research on situational interviews shows that asking questions based on this is a more valid predictor of job success than using future-oriented questions. This does not mean, however, that future-oriented questions should not be used. Rather, they must be carefully crafted so the responses can be adequately assessed, measured, scored, whatever word you prefer to use. Now, let's digress here just a little bit and look at some information here as information gathering, which we're not going to go to in interviewing. We've talked about this before, but it's very important to repeat that the interview is the most often used selection test. And so remember, if you will, and we've talked about this before, that a test has to be job related. And in some way, it has to predict success on the job, or perhaps a better way of saying that is to predict who will not be successful on the job. So I want you to remember that an interview is a test. And if it is a test, then there has to be some type of scoring mechanism. You know, tests are under fire in this country. We have complaints of teachers in grade school and or let's change that, or elementary school, junior high school, and high school, teaching to the test. And we don't think that that allows freedom of thought. It doesn't allow people to explore beyond parameters, et cetera, et cetera. And I certainly agree to that. But you have something that's a test, and the test therefore must be measurable. Now you're not trying to teach this person to the test. Rather, you're giving this person a test and seeing how well he or she responds to the test questions. So this next bullet I'm not going to read to you because we've kind of gone over that. Questions posed, talk about education, experience, job knowledge, etc. We may talk about mental abilities, personality, communication ability, and then other social skills. This just talks about the two types of interviews within the structured interview that we talked about, situational interview and then the behavioral interview. So we're going to go to the structured slide here. And I'm also going to bring some other parts in from Henneman, which will kind of corroborate some of this as well. So what we've given before is useful, but someone must be prepared to conduct a structured interview. Someone or someones. Now I'm saying someones in case you're going to use a group interview or a panel interview. Yes, if you have a group interview or if you have a panel interview, you have more than one person. A panel interview tends to be a little more structured in that people will ask questions in certain sequences, where a group interview is not quite as structured. Structured in who is going to ask the question, in what sequence first, et cetera, et cetera. So it's essential that the interview be familiar with the position for which the candidates are applying. If that person is not, then there's going to be a lot of trouble. So if you're going to use a panel or a group interview, by the way, there is a case study talking about a panel interview. If you're going to use that, then there has to be someone on that panel or group who knows the job. So if you're going to use a panel or a group, you ought to have somebody there and you ought to have each person on that panel or group has expertise in a certain area in which they're going to ask questions. So you may want to have just one job expert, but you may want to have somebody that can do a good job of assessing social skills, good job of assessing communication skills, and things of that nature. So the person, we're going to do this as one, has to be cognizant of job requirements. And regardless of whether or not the interviewer is a human resources professional or the hiring manager, Stewart and Brown state the interviewer must do the following. Determine how to measure the interview. Now we're going to talk about it right here, as the slide says here. So what you're going to do is you're going to use the job analysis, and of course, remember, a job analysis is going to be coupled with a job description and job specifications. So he or she should review that to assure that he or she is conversant with the knowledge, skills, and abilities the position requires. Notice the third bullet. The structured interview should have questions that focus on the attributes that are necessary for success on the job. You can call those traits, you can call them characteristics, you can call them whatever you want. But that's what you need to focus on. Write the interview questions. That's step 2. So if you're going to be just one person conducting this, you should, let's say you're the hiring manager, you should write the questions and then take those questions to someone in HR who is familiar with the way interviews should be conducted. Make sure that you have questions there that are not prohibited, that can't be asked. Make sure that the structure is in pretty good shape, and then help you decide maybe the sequence in which the questions were going to be asked. Talks about creating either behavioral or situation questions or a combination of both. And since we've talked about things like this in the past, a combination would probably give you a better rounded example of what this person that you're interviewing is capable of doing, or it should. And then, of course, make sure that, and we talked about this before, that the questions meet legal requirements, that you're not asking questions that you shouldn't be asking. And that's very important. The text has a list that you can look at to help you along the way. You may even want to say that you ask the person you're interviewing about certain questions and why they ask them or don't ask them, or whatever it happens to be. Remember also that the list that the authors show is not exclusive. So you may ask, there's a laundry list of questions, but are there other questions that you don't ask for whatever particular reason? The third thing you want to do here is design something that will help you evaluate the responses you receive to the questions. So, you should have something, this is a good answer, this is a fair answer, or average. Let's use that as a better term. This is a poor answer. And then you would score them, 5 being high, 3 in the middle, and 1 being unacceptable. And so you have some kind of an idea of what you think is a good answer. And get some feedback on that. Not only is the question properly constructed, but are sample answers on the mark. Give each question a numerical range. They may not all be the same. So you just have to figure that out, what the best thing to do that. And then you want to make sure that if you have more than one person, that everybody agrees to the evaluation system that has been generated. If you are only one person conducting it, then I think it's best to get some feedback from somebody else. Now, this is going to be difficult in a small company. Small companies don't have people falling all over themselves. They are limited to the resources that they have. And so you have to be careful about that. But by all means, get input into what you're doing. It just helps you to do that because it cuts down on the things that you need to do. It's always good when you construct any kind of a test like this. It's always best to get good feedback. One of the things in the feedback can tell you, well, did you think about asking some other question? This question isn't worded properly. It's kind of nebulous. It doesn't really say what it ought to say. It doesn't really ask what it ought to ask. So all those things should be thought of. Obviously, you also want to make sure that you're constructing an interview whether it's structured or unstructured, but since we're talking about structure, we're going to stick with that. That does not last forever. There's an old saying, and please don't take umbrage at what I'm going to say. The mind can only absorb what the seat can endure. And so if you're sitting for a long period of time, either you as the interviewer or you as an interviewee, after a while, concentration kind of wanders. That's just a natural type thing. You might think, when's this going to get over? How many more questions am I going to be asked if, in fact, you're on the other end of the questions? The interviewer may be thinking the same thing. I can't get this guy or gal to answer questions properly. But it's no reason to continue an interview. If you reach some kind of an impasse, now I'm talking about the interviewer. If you reach some kind of an impasse where you don't think you're getting what you need, then you have to figure out a way to conclude the interview. Very important that you do that. You don't want to keep people there longer than what's necessary. And by the same token, if you're not getting what you need, then continuing the interview is not going to be productive. And so that you've got to figure out how to cut that off and get rid of it. We mentioned unstructured interviews, non-structured, however you want to call them. This calls them unstructured here. But we need to look at it in more detail. The authors of our text state this is a comprehensive interview. Notice that. They say unstructured is a comprehensive interview. The sole purpose of this type of interview is to keep the candidate talking. Now, I want to stop here for just a second. Not only keep that person talking, but keep him or her engaged if you're going to do an unstructured interview. It's not as difficult with a structured interview because you're asking questions, you're getting answers. You're asking questions to which you expect certain type answers. In an unstructured interview, it's not easy to say you expect certain answers. Probably in some cases, the interviewer is expecting a certain type answer, but that doesn't mean he or she's going to get it. The interviewer uses probing questions to gather additional information after first responses are given. You can think of this person as being a facilitator in a focus group. And a facilitator in a focus group tries to use these probing, after an answer is given, use probing questions to elicit more information, to fill in the picture, if you will. If you're going to do this, if you're going to use unstructured interviews, then you need to be schooled, trained in how to do that. It's not everybody that can sit across the desk from somebody, or sit across the table, or sit side by side, or chair facing chair, and say, what do you mean by that? And be able to follow that up with another probing question to get the type of response that you're looking for. It's just everybody doesn't have that skill. Now, I submit to you it's a skill that can be trained. It's a skill that can be learned, but you just don't go into an unstructured interview and sit down and say, okay, in your mind, this is unstructured, and I'm going to be able to get all the information I want to get. It doesn't happen that way. And so if you have to be trained in how to conduct a structured interview, and I submit to you that's correct as well, you have to be doubly trained to conduct an unstructured interview. So we're saying that this person has to be a skilled interviewer. Obviously, that goes for the structured interview as well. You can't say, well, you have to be skilled in one and not the other. No, you got to be skilled in either one, depending upon what you're using. So you have to be a skilled interviewer. And of course, if you're a skilled interviewer, you should be able to conduct either type interview. Just go just a little bit further, and that simply is that this person knows how to get the additional information from the job candidate that's necessary. The authors provide a list of questions used in non-structured interview format on page 210 in the text. And I'll just look at this just for a second. Tell me something about yourself. Why did you want to leave your present job? What are your primary strengths? What are your primary weaknesses? It's an interesting question about primary weaknesses. Most people don't like to admit to weaknesses, and they're afraid if they do, that will knock them out of a job. And so a lot of times you'll hear someone say, well, I'm sure that I have weaknesses, but I'm really not too sure exactly what they are. Or yes, I do have some weaknesses, but I'm trying to work to overcome those. And it's a very difficult thing, because when you ask a person that question and then a person responds in some way, you're actually in a figurative way, not literal, figurative way, undressing that person or asking that person to undress him or herself and give unvarnished answers. So it's kind of difficult. This type interview, this unstructured interview, has obvious negatives, at least to me. First being that a better composed interviewee. Now, you can also say this to structured interviews as well, but not quite as much. Who speaks well and has a high verbal capacity will likely have a better result. Second, ranking the applicants or candidates is very subjective in that, among other things, the interviewer may be influenced by someone's command of the language. We kind of talked about that before, and perhaps his or her dress. Take that a step further. If this is the case, the better speaker, a better well-dressed person, or a better well-dressed candidate will be selected when he or she may not be the best candidate. That is what is known as first impression bias. Now, taking it a little bit step further, first impression bias generally says that the first person who, excuse this expression, knocks the socks off the interviewer, he or she is going to get the job, and anybody else who comes after doesn't stand a chance. First impression bias, there's a lot of work that's been done on that, and it is quite common, quite evident. It's very difficult because every interviewer has some kind of bias. Now, that don't mean to say they're biased against a particular race or particular gender or particular age or anything else, but they have some kind of bias. They're looking for something, and when that something hits them, it's very difficult for them to unchange the mind. The mind is made up, and unfortunately, the way our minds work for the most part is once what we're looking for has been reaffirmed or has been affirmed, our mind tends to close like a steel trap. In other words, we've baited something, somebody took the bait, and it's closed, and it's very difficult to open that up to new experience. So we have to be very careful about that, and that's what the unstructured interview leads to. Probably more important is that this type of interview has low reliability and low validity, and it may be very difficult to defend in legal action. Now, I must tell you that I don't have any information or have seen any research or any data that said somebody did not get a job, was not selected for a job, and sued a company on wrongful hiring practices based upon an unstructured interview. I'm sure that's probably happened, but that probably wasn't in the lawsuit exactly the way I said it. I wasn't selected because the company used an unstructured interview. But it does. There's no basis. We can't really come to the point of saying, well, we did it this way, or we did it that way, or we did some other way, and we don't have a scoring decision here, a scoring thing to back up. So we don't know whether what we've done is correct. So we have to be careful about that. I'm not telling anybody, and I'm going to get to provide some more information a little bit later. I'm not telling anybody, don't, if you're in this business, or if you get into this business and you graduate and you get to an HR job, or maybe you're working in HR now and you have a higher standing job or a job with more responsibilities. I'm not telling you don't use an unstructured interview. I'm not going to say that. What I'm going to say is that if you do decide to have an unstructured interview, you have to have some way to measure it. And so, it's just, it has to be something that comes up that you can figure out how you're going to measure this. So there's some defense on what you've done. I'm not talking about defense in case there's a court case. I'm talking about being able to defend the fact that you made this decision, that you selected this person versus someone else. If we use a structured interview, as we've talked about before, we have a scorecard, or we should have a scorecard. And an unstructured interview by their very nature, or unstructured interviews by their very nature, don't have scorecards. And so we have to pay attention to that and make sure that our selection is on solid ground, not because we're worried about somebody going to file a court case against us or a lawsuit against us, but because we have to be able to defend the selection we made. And we've talked about in this course what the problems with making poor selection is. I mean, that causes the recruiting process to start over and everything else to start over. So, it's like realistic job previews. We said before, you give a candidate a realistic job preview, his or her chances of remaining with the company are a lot higher, turnovers reduced. And certainly something that you don't want to incur costs when you don't have to. Regardless of the type of interview used, structured or unstructured, Ivancovich says that the job interview, again, is a conversation between two or more people that has a specific purpose. We're kind of repeating what we said at the beginning, but just a little bit differently, I hope. Interviewer and the candidate tried to determine if there's a fit. Fit can be between the interviewee and the job, or between the organization and the interviewee. Ask the person you interview, that you're going to conduct the interview with, whether his or her organization uses job fit or organization fit, or a combination when they're selecting someone. Now, if you are interviewing someone that is in a position where they have a lot of turnover, like a fast food restaurant might have, or something of that nature, they probably are looking for a job fit, or somebody at least can do the job, because most of the jobs are routine and there's little training required. So that's probably a job, but can they do the job? That's what you're concerned about. If you're at a larger organization, like I know at least one of you is, it may be more important that the person is able to fit the organization's values than it is that the person is able to do a particular job. I'm reminded, this is a little bit of a digression, but I'm reminded about St. John College in the general area of Annapolis, Maryland. And St. John is a well-known liberal arts college in the United States. Well, it's well-known in academia. It may not be well-known by the general public. And I was stationed in the D.C. area, Annapolis, not too far away from the district. And there was an article in the Washington Post that profiled St. John's. And one person, I don't know whether this person was in HR, was a hiring manager or CEO or whatever, and it said, well, we know when we get the folks from St. John's to come in for a job interview that they may not know too much about the job, but once they get to training, we don't ever have to worry about them. They have that intelligence to continue to do what they need to do. And so this is what this is talking about here, organization fit. So file that answer, whatever answer you get here, job fit, organization fit, by asking why the organization chooses one over the other. Pardon me, why is the job fit? Why is job fit more important than what organization fit is? How does the organization arrive at its hiring decision? Something that you need to understand. Is it on the basis of the interview? Or is it on the basis of the interview and some other tests that the individual has taken or has been required to take? Now, of course, reference checks and background check fall into that, but all things being equal, assuming that those two things, reference checks and background check, and of course then physical examination, drug and alcohol screening, those all come back as the way you want them, then what is it that they use to determine the hiring decision? What did they base the hiring decision on? Based on interview responses, knowledge, skills, experience, KSAOS, education and other factors, or other factors. Do personal appearance and good communication skills factor into the hiring decision? If so, why? How? Again, you want to probe on these. You don't want to be argumentative when you ask them. The way I'm kind of giving them to you probably does sound argumentative, and I don't mean it to be that way. But you need to find that out. Those questions are very important. Are interviewers trained to look for both nonverbal and verbal cues and clues? Nonverbal more than verbal. Someone will say there's no such thing as a verbal cue or clue, but I will tell you that there is. But it's usually accompanied with a nonverbal. Face is skewed in a certain way. Somebody might smile, eyebrows raised, or whatever it happens to be. How do interviewers overcome first impression bias? Well, I talked to you about that before, introduced that concept to you before. It's a big issue, and you have to be able to get past that. How do they do that? It's not easy. Somebody walks into your office and they're well dressed, and I'm not talking about necessarily having a coat and tie on like I do for a male, or having a certain type of pantsuit or dress for a woman. But they look good. They're well, have a good appearance to them. They're clean. They give off a nice aura about themselves. Carry themselves well, or comport themselves well, which might be a better way of saying that. And then they add to that, or they embellish that by speaking well. Good diction, good command of the language, etc. So when you have, that's the first person that comes in to see you. And when you get that, Mr. or Miss Interviewer, how do you set that aside and don't use that as the yardstick to measure every other candidate that comes in? Or conversely, if you've already had 2 or 3 candidates that you've talked to, and now this person comes in and gets this impression I talk about, does that negate those other people before them? So, these things, and it's when I'm saying first impression bias, and don't think first impression bias simply says the first person. And that's probably what it does mean in a way, but it's the first person that comes in that more than meets expectations by appearance, speaking, dialogue, and things of that nature. Prohibited questions generally fall into the categories of those that may get the employer in legal trouble. Include questions about race, marital status, religion, etc. Some questions may seem innocuous, But if a person who did not get the position complained to EEOC and he or she could show bias, that would cause the entire selection process to be null and void. So even though you may know the answer, ask the person being interviewed if there are prohibited questions. Now, again, there is a list on page 224 in the text, and I'm sure that the person that you're talking about is familiar with that list, not necessarily that textbook, but with that list. But you might ask if there are questions they simply don't ask. I know I've mentioned this before, but it's very important to get that. It's very important to understand why they don't ask those questions. If there's a question that's not on what I'm going to use to say is the common list, why don't they ask that question? Good to find out. In preparing for your interview, you want to ask yourself some questions. And I'm going to talk about this, and then we're going to go back again and bring up some more information about structured and unstructured interviews. I'm not going to take a break this evening. We're going to work straight through this process. We're at about 53 minutes now or so. Normally I take a break, but I don't have a whole lot more to do, probably another 20 or 30 minutes. And I want to go ahead and get through with this with you and then not take a break and come back. Obviously, when you watch the videos, there's a break in there, and I don't want to do that. If I could figure out a way to stop the video and then come back and pick it up again, I'd do that. I've not been able to figure that out. So you want to ask yourself some questions, such as, where do I begin? Yeah, I know the answer to that is I begin at the beginning. But you want to think about what questions are the most important to ask. And so you might want to start off with some what I would consider to be softball questions. And that's simply putting the person at ease as that person would put somebody else at ease. How are you today? And so on and so forth, and things of that nature. Obviously, at the beginning, thank the person for taking time out of his or her schedule to agree to the interview, and make sure you thank them on the way out. And then you also ought to think about, are there some questions I should avoid? I can't give you any parameters for that. I can't give you any suggestions for that. But you might want to think, is this something I really shouldn't ask? You might want to take your interview list, question list, and run it by a person that you trust. Important questions should be asked first, although I do think you want to set the scene, set the tone by asking the routine question, like, how are you today, and that sort of thing. But ask those questions that are important first, because that sets the tone, and it also keeps the other person engaged. He or she has consented to give up a percentage of his or her workday. And so you don't want to keep them there just asking questions because you have this assignment. Yes, this is an assignment, but you should be learning something from this assignment. You should be seeing how what we've conducted in a course, or what we've talked about in a course, the slides that we've had, the case studies that you worked, how they apply or how they may not apply. After you complete the self-examination process, prepare the list of questions you want to ask. Use the text or other resource to help you construct the questions. By all means, try to stay with your list. Don't jump around. It would be better for you to, if you're going to ask 10 questions, to start with number 1 and end with number 10 and go through the sequence, as opposed to jump around. That's not to say that somebody won't respond to you in a certain way, then you have to ask something else to get a little bit more information. So prepare the list. Important, because thinking of questions on the spur of the moment during the interview is not a good practice. Again, that's not meant to say that the person won't say something to you that will cause you to think of something else. But what I'm saying is go with a prepared list and then be adaptable if you have to be, or as you not if you have to be, as you need to be. Try to gain as much information as possible and clarify the answers you receive. That may mean by asking more questions. We don't talk about communication skills in this course. Probably ought to, but we don't. We only talk about things that are germane to human resource management and staffing. But one of the best things to do is to try to remember the number one thing to do in communications is to be a good listener. And so when a person says something to you, when it responds to your questions, if it's not real clear, or if you need more information, you say to that person, I understood you to say. Now, you don't have to regurgitate what he or she said back word for word. You're simply saying, I understood you to say, and you're paraphrasing, etc. That shows the person on the other end of the interview that you're paying attention to that person, and they're going to give you more information. It's easy to do that. An effective way to conduct the interview is to ask if the organization uses techniques pointed out in the text. You don't have to follow that, but this gives you some idea. A student I had in this course some years ago did that, and he would go in, he would take things out of the text, and he asked the person, I think the company he worked for, one of their HR people, is this what you do? Don't have to do that, but that gives you a guide. Helps you stay on track because you use the text to prepare your questions, and it's a double plus for you. Responses given should give you an idea of whether or not the organization presented follows what's presented in the text. Now, I want to make a point here. Simply because the organization does not follow what's in the text doesn't mean that they're not doing things they ought to be doing. The text is giving you something that is a model to follow. All companies won't follow the model. They'll have other reasons for deviating from the model. And so you might want to ask that question. Why don't you do this? Remember, don't make the question argumentative. Just say, I've learned so-and-so, and can you tell me why you don't use that method? It's critical that you control the interview, as you don't want the person being interviewed to wander off on a tangent that is irrelevant and meaningless. You may want to put your personality on the questions. For instance, you may remember questions from your job interview that you liked or ones that you didn't like, and find out if the organization uses that question or one that is similar and why. As we stated, or as I've stated here, it's important to get as much information as possible, but it's also important to record the responses as quickly as possible. Jot down the pertinent facts of what's being said, so help develop the salient pieces of the responses later. Make you be able to pick them out. If the person being interviewed states that some information is confidential, as I mentioned before, don't probe any further. Drop that, move on to something else. Let the person being interviewed know that you're asking questions as part of an assignment. I've mentioned this before for the course, and that all responses will be kept confidential. The person asks the company's name and his or her position, his or her name not be used. That's fine. After you've completed the interview, prepare a critical summary of the information obtained, and then compare and contrast that information with selecting and staffing concepts as presented in the text. It should be approximately 12 to 15 pages. Now, I mentioned I'm going to give you some other things here about interviews. I'm going to bring up another resource here. And this is from the Henneman text. And I'm not going to go over this all there, but let's look at some unstructured. Notice what Henneman says the unstructured is quick and dirty. Questions can be based upon hunches. Notice the next one, pet questions. I always want to ask a person this. Well, I think you'll find in a structured interview there's questions that are always asked as well, but they're not quite the same because there's some meaning behind that. This is most of the time you're going to have subjective answers, of course, because the questions are posed in that fashion. They're not objective. And so the scoring, whether it's done by number or by brain and memory, that's going to be subjective as well. Notice what he says. There are two other things I think that are very important. Henneman says that the questions asked tend to be highly speculative and that often the interviewer is unprepared. Now, I'm not sure exactly what Henneman means by that, but I can tell you that because it's an unstructured interview, it's not so much that the interviewer, him or herself, is unprepared to conduct the answer, but he or she is unprepared for the responses that he or she might get for a particular question. So that's always something to think about, the unstructured part. And then if you see the last thing, this question is open to, let me change that around. It's ripe for discrimination and for bias. You really have, those are things we know that have to be avoided in any type of interview. And remember, as I've said before, and we pointed out, and the courts have said this, not so much that I've said it, but courts have said it, this interview is a test. And so if it's a test, there should be, doesn't have to be, but there should be some structure to it. And it should be based on something, and there should be some objectivity to it. Now, yeah, somebody's going to tell me, well, I took tests when I was in high school, and I took the test when I was maybe in college or something. It was an essay, and I had to write an essay. Well, yeah, okay, you did. But within that essay, you had to respond to the question that was being asked, and you had to be able to prove somewhere along there that you understood what was going on. So while essays tend to be open-ended, it's not answering A, B, C, D, or E. It's not answering true or false. It's not a matching type thing. But it does have to have some structure to it. Notice that what they say here, and I don't remember exactly if the other slide that I showed, everybody is asked the same questions. Now, I'm always quick to point out that those questions don't have to be asked in the same sequence. And as a matter of fact, you may want to vary the sequence depending upon the number of candidates you're going to interview in a particular day. But you're asking the same questions. And you should have, and you have a scoring sheet. And talked about anchored rating scales, and then of course the last thing, training people to conduct interviews is going to increase both the reliability and the validity. Now, the validity not as much, because the interview should be measuring what it says it's going to review, but the reliability is, which means that you get consistent results time after time after time after time. So the interviewer is trained. You're going to have a better outcome from that. This just gives you structured interviews, situation, experience. He says it a little differently. Behavioral would be experience here, and we can make up our mind which we want to use, look at the last comment there, and the comment says is that there's no definitive research that says one of these is better than the other. And again, this is going to give you some repeat of what we've talked about before. Have a selection plan. Make sure that you look at the job requirements before you develop the test. Benchmark responses. The last two, very important. Goes back to what we talked about before, and that's training the individuals to conduct the interview. But the last one is most important. Somehow and we didn't talk about this before when the other slides we had. Somehow you have to measure the effectiveness of your interview process. Now, if in fact the interview is the test that's used, the way you would measure this is to see how well the candidate selected performs on the job. And so you would have some kind of an idea of knowing whether your test, your structured interview, is actually measuring what it's supposed to measure. And remember, we're using the job description, we're using the job specification, we're using the job analysis to construct a structured interview questionnaire. That's my questionnaire, my term. And so then we've selected X candidate out of X number, X candidate out of Y number. It's a better way to put that, I suppose. And so then we would want to go back sometime later to the supervisor, manager, whatever person is in charge, department chief, whatever the title is, and find out if that candidate is actually successful on the job. And if he or she is, then we have some way of knowing that the selection process that we've used, the selection test that we've used, the interview, is actually both reliable and valid. Doesn't mean to say it shouldn't be tweaked. Doesn't mean to say we stop where we are. What it simply says is that what we're using is a good measurement tool because it is giving us what we want. Now I want to give you a little bit more here about interviews and structured and unstructured. Stewart and Brown provide some interesting material about job interviews. One is that because the interviewee is trying to sell him or herself, the interviewer may not see the whole person. So if the person is a good salesperson, the candidate's a good salesperson, some of the warts may be glossed over. Furthermore, the interviewer cannot assume that people who are good at making first impressions will be the best employee. Now, we've talked about that before, maybe not enough, but it's very important that we get past that problem. Some research contends that the interview is not a good way to select job candidates. It is neither reliable nor valid, which is a little bit different than what Henneman is telling us here. Recent research does take the opposite viewpoint of that, but we have to know that there is that other research out there that says that. But I would think that, or you should think, that if you have a good structured interview, if it's based upon what you need to ask, and you've done a good job of figuring out what are good answers, what are average answers, what are poor answers, and scoring well, and then doing follow-up to see if the person selected is doing what you expect him to do or her to do, you probably have a pretty good idea of where you are. Interviews are time-consuming. We can't change that, and costly. As a result, organizations should not interview candidates unless they have successfully passed through preliminary screening. And so, yeah, we know that part of the screening process is initial screening, et cetera. And there may be a secondary screening, which is another interview. Well, preliminary screening is probably not an interview. Secondary screening does have an interview. Whether or not people get job tested for some reason, whether there's some kind of test that goes along with it. And then what this is saying is only want to take people that have done well on that preliminary screening. Interviewers are biased and often make subjective judgments. That talks about unstructured interviews, as far as I'm concerned. That does not mean to say that structured interviews rule that out, but the more structured the interview, the less biased there ought to be. Consider the conclusions reached by Sharon Segrist Purkis, Pamela Puri, Trina Gillespie, and Bronson Mays, and Gerald Ferris in their research that they published, Implicit Sources of Bias in Employment Interview Judgments and Decisions in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processing, 101, published 2006, pages 152 to 167. They said, the results of the present study indicate that to a degree, interviewers are still allowing illegal and often irrelevant factors, such as the combined effects of ethnicity and accent, to affect judgments and decisions about job applicants. You might want to use candidates there instead of applicants, but that's the word they use. Instead of focusing on job-related qualifications. In essence, they conclude, we are still judging the book by the cover rather than solely by the content. Now, here is some more information about structured and unstructured interviews. We may be covering some ground that we've already covered, but I think it's really important to talk about this because this is what gets us in trouble, as we have to remember that the interview is the most often used test for selection. Structured provides consistency. Everybody's asked the same question, et cetera, et cetera. It keeps the interviewer and the interview in legal compliance. And it helps not to overlook important areas, hopefully. Structured interviews are often designed and approved by the HR folks. They should be. Those are the folks that are really skilled in interviewing. So they are the ones that ought to look at the structured interview and give it a blessing, if you will. Structured allows the interviewers to quickly determine a candidate's viability, his or her value, and if that person should move to the next round of interviews, assuming there is another round of interviews. It's especially useful in initial and phone interviews. You know, the text talks about that being part of either an initial interview or perhaps a secondary screening interview. And we have to look at these as weeding out tools, as we've talked about before. We can compare results easily because we've got a scorecard. Actually, more than one scorecard for each candidate. So we can compare the results. It's time sensitive. We don't have to worry about going back and going through our computer up here and saying, oh, okay, well, this person did this and this person did that. Somebody else did something else. Everybody's evaluated the same. We use the same questions. We're not evaluating people differently. And hopefully, it should increase the fairness of the interview. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, eliminate bias and potential discrimination. And then it also keeps the interviewer on track. He or she is talking about job-related issues. Now, yeah, sure, they're going to ask for some background and things of that nature, which are not necessarily job-related. But it keeps the focus on the job. It keeps the interviewer from wandering, and it should keep the interviewee focused. Unstructured, it could start with a script, but once the ice is broken, the interviewer will go off onto some tangent that he or she wants to do, which are what he or she thinks are most important. Sometimes the unstructured interview is used to examine relevant job issues that have not been answered on the applicant's or candidate's resume. Sometimes. Unstructured interview is a valuable tool for finding out more about the candidate because you're asking open-ended questions and perhaps how he or she will relate to a specific situation. Of course, that can be, pardon me, that can be done as often done in structured interviews. We know that because we ask either situational or behavioral type questions. The interviewer has the opportunity to explore statements that come up during the interview. I want to interject here that yes, that's true, but that does not mean that that cannot be done in a structured interview. What this is saying here, I'm taking this not out of context, but I'm taking this from the people that published this, and I'll give you their names here in a second. It doesn't mean to say structured interviews can't do that. All it says about structured interviews is that structured interviews follow a script. Doesn't mean to say that there cannot be some injection of various and sundry things that need to be asked. Because it is less formal, the interviewer and the candidate have a better chance of developing rapport. Well, that may be good and that may be bad because we may now be into first impression bias. The first person that establishes a good rapport with the interviewer is going to have a better chance of getting over. I don't mean getting over, of getting the position because of the supposed camaraderie that's been established. So you have to be careful about that. That's, pardon me, it's not to say that you don't want to establish a rapport in a structured interview. Yes, you do. But when it's unstructured, it's kind of folksy type, it's a little bit easier. Vanderzee, Baker, and Baker published the results of the research regarding structured versus unstructured interview, which is what this material comes from that I've just given you, in an article titled, Why Are Structured Interviews Rarely Used in Personnel Selection, which appeared in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 2002. The authors state there are several reasons why structured interviews are less popular. Interviewers may not know of the academic research that supports structured interviews. Notice we've said here a couple of times that there's some doubt about that, but there seems to be more evidence today that a structured interview is better, and that interviews themselves, if they're structured, have a better result than those that are not. Some interviewers may be aware of the research, but question its credibility. This to me is saying that, well, I'm smarter than the average bear. These researchers did all this stuff, but they don't know, and they've not been through this, and so on and so forth, continuing. And kind of in a way, as far as I'm concerned, deluding themselves. Structured interviewers keep the interviewer hemmed in, not allowing freedom, autonomy, and the need to exert influence, power over the interviewee. So what this is saying is that the interviewer, the structured interviewer, is in charge, and he or she is going to dictate what happens, and they don't allow for free-flowing thought. Now, I would tell you, and I think I've said before in this last hour and 20 some odd minutes that we've been talking here, that that's not necessarily correct. The object of a structured interview is to follow a script, to ask questions that have been checked and double checked, they're job related, or yeah, they're job related. They may be experience related, which obviously falls to the job. They may be education related, which is incumbent upon the job or the job's incumbent upon it, or aligns with the job. Maybe that's a better way to say that. But it doesn't mean to say that they can't allow people to elaborate. So the problem here is when people don't use structured interviews, they think that there's no freedom. And that's just is not correct. At least it's not correct as far as I'm concerned. Unstructured interviews promote warmth and focus attention on the interviewee, not on the questions being asked. Well, yeah, I can see that. But I would submit to you that there's ways that a structured interview can address that same issue. Structured interviews may be seen as counter to the organization's philosophy, and as a result, they're frowned on. Let's say an organization. Well, let's use a general field. The general computer field, general information technology field, has championed probably more than any other type organization in the United States, has championed freedom, has championed flat organizations, not stovepipe, top to bottom. They've championed free-flowing communication, communication at all levels and to all levels. And so if you follow that, you could see that those folks may have a bias against using a structured interview because that is not our philosophy. Our philosophy is free-flowing, and we empower employees, and we do all these other things. And so if we get to this structure, A or B follows A and C follows B, etc., we're going against our grain, and we don't want to do that. So that could be a problem, but that can be ameliorated. It doesn't have to be that. And what this is doing is just saying, well, black's black and white's white, and we can't. There's no melding. So it can be taken care of. Obviously, somebody has to stop and think about it. How do we stick to our organizational values and still do a structured interview? I think that can be easily done. You're not going to snap your fingers and do it. Somebody's going to have to sit down and figure out a way to construct this to make sure it's meaningful. Finally, interviewers may lack sophistication and background to conduct a structured interview. I don't agree with that. Why is a person who conducts an unstructured interview any more sophisticated than someone else? We have to stop and think about that. What this is saying here is that the person who's doing a structured interview has to follow a script, and he or she is allowed no latitude. This is just the way it is, lockstep after lockstep after lockstep. And I submit to you, as I said before, that can be fixed. That can be addressed. Interviewers, regardless of whether they're going to do unstructured or structured, have to be trained in what they're going to do, how to approach it. You don't want to make the interview an adversary advocate type situation. That doesn't work. And so what the thought process here is, if it's unstructured, I won't get into that adversarial position. I can remember years ago going through an interview. I was used as an experience going through an interview, and I remember there was a test I had to take. I've forgotten what it was, and I got called back in. The guy said, "Well, you didn't answer 4 questions correctly, so we don't want to consider you, or you can take the test again." So I took the test again, came back in, and he said, "Well, you changed the 4 answers." I don't know if I changed the 4 answers or not, but I was pretty well convinced that I did not want to work for that company simply because of the attitude of the guy who kind of did interview me, and then had me take the test and retake the test, etc. And I wound up losing a lot of time that day. Whether it was valuable or not, we can talk about, we could debate. But I certainly didn't have a good impression of that company, specifically the interviewer, when I left. Whether he was doing this structured interview or an unstructured, I couldn't tell you. But he was caustic, and so it didn't make any difference. And that's why I'm saying a structured interview or an unstructured interview, whoever conducts that has to be trained in a proper way of conducting an interview. We're talking about people skills here, and you have to know how to do that and how to arrange that and the things to do and the things to avoid in conducting any type of interview, structured or unstructured. Well, I have come to the end of what I want to present for this evening. And that is, this is our last formal lecture, which I'll have uploaded for you tomorrow. There are some notes for next week. If you have questions about how you should proceed on the interview, by all means, contact me. My phone number is listed on the syllabus, but you call the 800 number, 1-800-861-6400, extension 1223, or you can always send me an email. You do have my email address, but just in case, it's Frederick, FREDERICK.read, READ, @myunion.edu. Thank you for your attention this evening, and again, I'll have this uploaded tomorrow. Thank you and good night.